Hello everyone, today we talk about Ottoman artillery, which is a topic we addressed on many occasions without actually making a structured video about it. We mentioned it for many reasons actually. The first one could be just a merely historiographical one, that is to say, there are prejudices relatively to Ottoman artillery and more in general this kind of idealization of the Western versus Eastern clash during the Turkish wars with Christian Europe, and this is an idea that in many ways we have, dissected and disarticulated and in many ways debunked, especially for what concerns the struggle of against the Ottomans, right? That we have described in many videos in their, let's say, roots as something very different from what is, objectively does exist as a sort of an Eastern, relatively to Europe, dimension that the same Ottomans were to cope with, right? If you think about the Golden Horde, if you think about Safavid Persia, even in part Egypt, I mean, the thing in there with the Mamluks is slightly different, but objectively the Ottoman Empire was something different from the same East, right? First of all, it was properly a much more European than an Asian power, and it grew actually in one area just facing the Bosphorus that was intensely Romanized and Westernized in many ways. Of course, the Ottoman Empire rose essentially through the contribution of so many Europeans. So as we will see today, even the same Ottoman artillery had a dramatic importance as not just as advisors or engineers, but also as troops. I mean, the Ottomans ruled the Balkans, and as such they mobilized the local troops and even polities that were fundamentally at the frontier and that prefer sometimes actually to side as Christians with the Ottomans than with other Christians. Welcome to the history of real history, right, where things happen, and we, aside from, ideological extremizations, right. But other prejudices have to do with this presumption that the Ottoman world, the Ottoman military especially, didn't develop firearms as much and as well as the West, right, and this is in part true when you observe the handguns, right? As we've explained many times, like the Ottomans never quite developed the same, let's say, missile power, firepower at the level of infantry as the West did, right? The pike and shot tactics and eventually linear tactics were in many ways, much more effective than anything the Ottomans could serve in terms of infantry, right? And that was literally the only one Ottoman weakness, right? It was compensated actually with, many other elements, such as, light cavalry, light infantry, and even artillery that, telling the truth, was dramatically advanced and was employed in ways and in quantities also, and with certain techniques that also the West for a time didn't access to. For example, the so-called granulation of powder, right? It was very important. It was basically the single most important improvement in firearms technology up to the bayonet, right? And that was an Ottoman thing. Ottoman cannons were meant to emit white smoke, while the European ones was black. And this has to do naturally with this dramatic improvement that artillery had in Ottoman times, especially starting from the beginning of the 15th century. And today we will see how the thing began, and because that's quite debated. And in this sense, Ottoman artillery and gunpowder in general wasn't absolutely lacking elements of competition with the European one for a very long time. When after the Battle of St. Gothard, Raymond de Montecuccoli, that had seized the Ottoman baggage train, looked at Turkish powder, said, this is as good basically as the Western one. We are at the second half of the 17th century. So the myth that has been developed, I don't really know why, historiographically speaking, that the West somehow defeated the Ottomans thanks to the improvement in firearms technology is actually wrong, and it derives largely from the idea that since the Europeans developed this effective, as we were saying before, pike and shot tactics and eventually linear tactics that were indeed superior to the Ottoman infantry, well, this had to apply basically to a sort of superiority in technology. And as we have explained ad nauseam, an infinite amount of time, especially studying the Formkrieg, etc., technology is literally one of the single least important things in warfare in every single time in history. I know that certain people, could bang their head against the wall, even in here, infinitely, ad nauseam, or to simply break their head and still not be convinced by this, but that simply means to be overloaded with modernistic and technologistic prejudices and basically maybe being acquainted with, scientific notions especially in a functional and technical approach, but basically understanding nothing about history of technology or history of warfare for that matter. And I'm very serious about this because we're developing, unfortunately, this kind of, I don't even know how to define it, subculture of people that say, okay, yeah, I know about warfare because I've read a bunch of books and that's it, right? That's not the way it happens, right? Until you don't picture the concept, for example, that tactics make weapons and not the other way around, you can't practically say to have a strategic culture like military historical education. It's a farce, it's a parody, and especially in this context it means that not knowing what were the actual struggles of the Europeans against the Ottomans, and what are the broader political and social implications of the military systems. Furthermore, we have properly historical difficulties to understand, to compare these systems, since the Ottoman Empire is dramatically underdocumented historically and historiographically speaking compared to the West. Right? We have an extraordinary understanding of what the West was in this. Today we will be talking about the 14th, 15th century, and the West has specific characteristics that allow it to store an immense amount of sources in a systematical way with this archivistic capability with a dramatic development of the same continent during these centuries. The Ottoman Empire, as big as it was a different society. It's also less studied. The same local historiographers do not produce at least as much as we do. In the West, there are interesting intersections especially for what concerns Balkan historiographies, right, of countries that were under the Ottomans at that time, therefore need to study that context. But those are also countries that at the time were very different from the ones in Western Europe and produced also less. So in many ways we don't have much of information. We will see today what we know about this war. This is valid also for Eastern Europe, right? If you look at Poland or Russia or other areas, you'll see that fundamentally we know more from Western European observers than from the local production, because these societies they didn't have fundamentally the same vitality within the middle classes, and they were, on average, like there was a lower per capita wealth. It was less production of surplus in many ways. So this has to do with the thing, but this has not much to do actually with the strictly military level of the story, right? The actual effectiveness, and especially looking at the Ottoman Empire, especially at this point, right? The apex is considered in many ways the first half of the 16th century, the Ottoman military warfare. And when you look at these declines that begin at one point and last for centuries and centuries, like a bit like the Byzantine Empire, it began to decline. Yeah, the empire began to decline in the 4th century. Yeah, and it lived for another millennium. And if this is what we define as decline, where we should maybe check our vocabulary meaning in this sense, because it doesn't quite seem to be the same meaning we give conventionally to a decline. So the obvious realization, this is not a very insightful historical judgment, and these systems were highly competitive, and we simply see it from Western observers that even in firearms, handguns technology, for example, documented and interesting. There is all evidence, for example, of Ottoman sniping in these, especially moments of expansion of the empire that entailed a lot of siege warfare, right? And this kind of war of position, in which sniping, this as the Ottomans might not fielded this thousands of intensely drilled arquebusiers, and in the same way Westerners still the fewer, say better, troops they had, as much as they could differ in some way, which is also questionable a bit. We'll see now, could deploy other means that were equally ingenious, and guess what? Different contexts produce different systems that, however, can cope equally well, at even odds with the others we're more used to see, right? Because another concept, and this is what I've tried to stress on the videos about Ottoman warfare, is that we tend to naturally consider that our idea of Western Europe, narrowly meant of the West proper, is born thanks to the Ottoman Empire. I mean, if there hadn't been the Turkish wars, the Europe would have had a very different idea of itself, right? During the 16th, the 17th century, we actually created the West in our, in fact, Western historiography. We started to think of ourselves in a way in relation to what the Turk was, right? And this is dramatically important because from one side it has naturally triggered dramatic developments and ideas and ways of perceiving it. But at a certain, from another, this has brought to try to avoid, but not to deny, the intersections that we had with that world. Because as we were saying before, actually when we talk about Turks, actually we're talking very often about a lot of Europeans and even a lot of Christians, telling the truth, that populated en masse the Ottoman armies. And we're not talking about the Devshirme, Christian kids from the Balkan hinterland drawn forcibly and converted to Islam. We're talking about actual Christian princes and their armies that were willingly given to the Sultan to maybe, I don't know, take the Wallachians that didn't like the Hungarians at all, right? And they wanted to be out there. They preferred the Turks, of course, to the Hungarians, or other similar stories, right? So literally, it was us, right, within the Ottoman Empire. We were there as Europeans, as Christians, as Westerners, wherever you want to find yourself in this historical perspective, but and with all the anachronism that it naturally entails, even from this point of view, but that's the reality of the story. So if we, for example, pretend that the Ottomans were something radically different coming from, the steppes of Central Asia, because they were Turks, right? Just know that that's not history. As much as it is not history that the Ottoman army was something so dramatically different, even, for example, in material culture, in these technologies to the West. Sometimes because we actually share the same technologies. Right? Because the Ottoman Empire was full of Western advisors all the freaking time, as we'll see now. And I always introduce Ottoman warfare in these terms because it's a way of objectively, recognizing what we were in that context, and forgetting about that by saying, it fitted like in the terrible, evil Turk that was from the other side. That doesn't actually help, nor to have a healthy historical understanding of the situation. But secondly, it doesn't even render justice to the Westernness that the Ottomans had because of European legacy, right, and Christian legacy, and much more in this regard, right? Always given that, of course, the Ottomans had their own uniqueness as any other power out there. right? But a universal empire is defined by multiculturalism in itself, and it cannot work in a different way, right? The Ottomans were the protectors also of their Christian and Jewish subjects, for example, not just the Muslim rulers that kept out all the rest, right? The cooptation with the Christian nobility was all over about Ottoman policy, right? And as pragmatic as it could be, it was exactly what was done from the other side, right? Just look at that video we made on the Christian conquest of Tunis, right? Muslims fighting for the Christians to stem the Turkish advance, for example. In any case, when we talk about Ottoman warfare, the main problem we have is, as we were saying, of documentation, and especially in its origins. As we have seen in many videos, the rise of the Ottomans wasn't envisaged for a long time, but the same Western Europeans as a big deal, right? In many ways, the Ottoman advance was catalyzed, even in a positive sense, by the Christian powers, right? Sometimes the Ottomans were literally saved by the Christians. The internal clashes within the dynasty that could have made crumble the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of 15th century, so relatively late, if you think about the first half of the 15th century, were recomposed by the Hospitaliers, were recomposed by the Venetians, right? So in that strategic context that we also analyzed in other videos, there's a playlist on Ottoman history, so you can check that out. Of course, like any other power out there, there was no predictability of who would have stand from there, like which would have been the power taken over from a moment to another. It was until very late, actually, that it was evident, for example, Constantinople would fall, right? The same siege of Constantinople had nothing deterministic in it. Certain blogs and books used to read, Constantinople, since was doomed to fall, right? This is not something you can say in politics. There are always factors that can revert the situation, right? For example, the thing you read is that the Timurid invasion of Anatolia belated the conquest of Constantinople, but was doomed to fall. No, because for anybody who has studied the history, the Ottomans at one point after the invasion were about to crumble, to implode actually in their fratricide wars, and they might have been wiped out, literally, right? Because Constantinople would have probably never reverted to the empire as we know it, but this still has nothing to do with one of the most complicated and unstable theaters of late medieval history, where we have to be very concrete about it. As a consequence, the same Ottoman Empire wasn't such. The Ottomans before at this time, we're talking about we'll see now from essentially the second half of the 14th century onwards, were not meant to be the next protagonists, right? There were many other powers that might have emerged at some point from the area, and that didn't, and that of course we know not much about, because guess what? They didn't become an empire stretched over 3 continents. The same goes for the Ottomans at this point. That their rise was so rapid that their early documentation is scarce. And talking about artillery, the problem is that we do not exactly know when this was implemented, right? When the Ottomans adopted, if you want, gunpowder artillery. There are many claims in this regard. For example, Cipolla said, quoting non-contemporary sources, that an iron gun was already made at Brusa in 1364 under Ottoman rule, that the Ottomans even introduced artillery in India, allegedly in 1368, that the Ottomans used cannons as early as 1387 in their campaign against the Karamanlis, right, in southeastern Anatolia, or even at the Battle of Kosovo Polje in 1389 against the Serbs. Others say that Ottoman artillery was present at the Battle of Nicopolis against the Crusaders in 1396, albeit some scholars are more than skeptical about this. There is a 15th century Bulgarian chronicle that actually claims that there was a cannon in Ottoman employment shortly before 1400 during the multi-year siege of Constantinople, where it started from the end of the 14th to first years of the 15th century. And also there are also 15th century authors proper, such as Ashik Pashadzadeh, right, that says that by the beginning of the 15th century the Ottomans didn't know artillery much, right, and guns in general, right, that they came into use regularly only under Murad II and Mehmed II, right, so we are at the mid-15th century, and the problem is that we have no clear idea, right, and today I think historiography maintains this prudential attitude. I don't know if it has somewhat improved in this regard, in a bit more of an open-minded sense, that the Ottomans were in possession of artillery soon after 1400 at the latest. Right, so there is enough room, as we'll see now, to suggest actually the Ottomans probably always made use of artillery, and certainly by the reign of Mehmed I, 1413, 1421, artillery was in regular employment, and also showed a marked increase, right, during the Hungarian wars. Also, given the strategic context, here was storming a lot of fortresses in the Balkanic heartland under Murad II. Right. And there are indeed historically reliable witness of use of guns in sieges by the Ottomans. For example, Constantinople in 1422. The defense of Antalya in 1424, Thessalonica 1430, before Constantinople, basically the most important siege there, Belgrade in 1440, and at the Strait of Corinth in 1446, the Xamilian, and also field guns seem to have developed in parallel with the same intensity, making their first documented appearance in the 1440s at the very latest, but being probably in regular use already by the 20s of the 15th century. Now, about this, you see, you can't really add much more than this, because they're just voices. Like, you read this in a chronicle, often non-contemporary one, if we talk pre-1400. I don't know what archaeology is telling us at this point, but I personally, from a conceptual point of view, I would go as far as saying that the Ottomans basically employed gunpowder as soon as this was introduced. This is to say, if you look at the beginning of the Ottoman dynasty, as soon as it emerged. Right, because gunpowder at that point was being developed in Western Europe, in Mamluk Egypt, right? The powers on the lead in this sense on firearms construction, especially naval warfare. Firearms technology were Venice and the Mamluks, right? And these were powers of dramatic influence in the area where the Ottomans emerged from. Consider that Mamluk Egypt and for the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean in general was for the Muslims at least was the major political entity of reference, right? Even as models of power, etc. And the Mamluks might have gone as far as invading Anatolia at some point. They couldn't eventually, but there was this concrete possibility, in many ways actually overlapping to the following Ottoman conquests, at least in Asia and North Africa. and Venice, of course, like Venice being literally everywhere in the in the Eastern Mediterranean, and being at the top of naval engineering, artillery, gunpowder technology in general, right? And this, the areas where the Ottomans emerged from were under the constant influence of such powers. So to claim that by the 14th century, like, we doubt whether the Ottomans ever employed artillery, it has not much of a meaning. The difference in here, that in many ways the Ottomans shared, for example, with their Byzantine neighbors, is that they were overall by the 14th century less competitive systems compared, especially to the Italians, and also to major powers like the Mamluks, and it's obvious that even the Byzantines were, for example, a bit more reluctant than the Westerners to use artillery. Why? Was there a cultural prejudice towards it? No, it's just they didn't have the money, right? Think about Orban's gun that was offered first to Constantine Dilemma. He said, no way. First of all, it will smash my own walls if I make it shoot from the top of them. Secondly, just because of recoil. Secondly, we don't have the money, right? In these systems, the Ottoman Empire wasn't largely centralized up to, the same conquest of Constantinople, which it inherited great part of its administrative and infrastructural legacy. Not that the Ottomans hadn't accomplished anything at that point, but, still they became probably a major threat only where Constantinople fell, right? It doesn't matter if the Westerners had already launched 2 crusades in order to hold them. That was because they were more interested in actually absorbing Eastern Christianity, reuniting East and West under the Roman Catholicism, than actually stemming the Ottomans, right? The Westerners freaked out properly, only when Constantinople fell, and it's not that it didn't help up to that point, but still the situation was a bit more complicated than it's often portrayed in terms of allegiances in that context. But the point I'm making here is that artillery also doesn't come at this point in late medieval history. We made quite more than one video about late medieval firearms, as in this differentiated pack between the fire, at least in typologies, between the firearm and the artillery, right? You can't be sure that if there is even the distinction in this sense, what it's really like, right? As long as there is firearms, wherever you see it, in every other context, there is both artillery and siege artillery and field artillery, as well as handguns, right? There is properly no stage in which one thing exists and the other doesn't, right? So the point is that doesn't matter how little firearms played in Ottoman warfare, we can at this point, but we can't be sure it was there, right? The same way it happens in the West. Right? You can't say at one point, like, since we don't have the direct evidence of it, then it didn't exist. It's silly. We know it simply because when these guns appear, they're already well developed and they're well integrated in these military systems. For the Ottomans, as we were saying before, artillery costs a lot, and in order to afford it, you need also some kind of important resources, and especially ways of maintaining them, organizing them. So it's obvious that in this context, that local production is not even important. Like it's obvious that the Ottomans preferably bought this stuff from, or had it built at least by foreigners, right? That was easy to do. Why? Because all the best craftsmen were from places like Italy or Germany, and the same Balkans actually can help us a lot. Pre-Ottoman Balkans had this at every level of material culture, had this connection. For example, look at the armor. With Milanese armor, were exported all over the Danubian area, right? You find Romanian princes in full plate Milanese armor. Guess where it came from, right? And in many ways, this is the same goes for the Serbians, other powers even more south than that. The same goes for the Byzantines. The same goes for the Ottomans. Why? Because you think that Ottoman troops never actually wore a Milanese plate armor, or they used some German-made arquebus at this time. Of course they did. They did regularly, and actually there is evidence of that. I don't know. I made actually a video. I don't remember which one it is from Ottoman warfare, but that we've seen that it is the case. So even in here, talking about Ottoman stuff as if there was that brand that said this is Ottoman, guys. We made it in Edirne, yay! It's not a thing, right? In Edirne, as we will say, actually Adrianople had its own foundry, from which important guns came from. And surely the process of territorialization of the Ottoman power that was already there at the beginning, but it got stabilized, and it, especially of centralization, entailed, of course, building weapons and armor production at a local level. But still, the point is that more than thinking that there were certain previous styles that kind of influenced for example, the typology of these weapons in that specific context is not taking into consideration that this stuff probably developed originally, right? And the point at the local level, and it adapted to a specific context, to the specific resources of the Ottomans, and the enemies were fighting the strategic situation, right? The improvement in artillery at this point in Ottoman history is dramatic, as we were saying before. Guess why? Because these guys stormed one city, one after the other, right? And sometimes even in very tough terrains, castles, fortresses, citadels that needed to be taken out with guns that in certain specific contexts that required different types of approach compared to other realities. This is important because it opens to another issue about Ottoman artillery that is very important. That is, that the Ottomans are normally considered to be the Muslim power, or the Eastern power, if you prefer, in a non-Western sense, to develop, artillery, if not at the earliest, right, compared to the others, but at least in a more functional, more systematic and structural way. And the second is definitely true. I mean, about the immediate employment of firearms, probably the Mamluks outreached the Ottomans, right? It's easy. The Mamluks were a very large, prosperous, well-established power by the 14th century. And they adopted the best technology immediately. They had the assets, they had the but we also made a video about the Mamluks that talks about that, so I would not repeat it myself, so it's said it in there, but about its characteristics. But the point is that definitely the Ottomans, during their rise, made this astonishing use of artillery in quantitative and in qualitative sense that is really impressive. Is not to be found in other contexts. Like if you find, for example, look at the Golden Horde, those began to use firepower fairly early, as far as we know, but they always had a cultural prejudice towards it, right? In many ways, because the Golden Horde was stretching over largely steppes areas that also in terms of neighboring populations and broader political, social and strategic issues were related to this preeminence, for example, of horse archery still in the Mongol tradition. Also Persia, for example, look at the Battle of Calderan against the same Ottomans, was still, the Ottomans looked more like a Western pike and shot army compared to Persian standards that were still based essentially on the Persian Mongol equestrian tradition, and that at that point, the defeat made them realize that it didn't work quite well anymore. So the Ottomans have this literal explosion of artillery, in their use, and their artillery became essentially even a sort of propagandistic weapon, right? The idea is this monster bombers that we will see in a while is very important also from an ideological point of view. The idea is that these are the great empire. They're the universal empire, the great rulers on the world, and they can destroy any city walls. And they conquered Constantinople. It was the golden apple, right? And that was the city of the cities in their views. The same Ottomans collect the Roman legacy, right? Of course, I know the Philo-Byzantines do not agree with this, but of course the Ottomans agreed by themselves that they were Caesars, by the way. So we should also be open to this concept because it's the only way to understand the evidence that we have, right? So personal opinions have zero importance in this context, and partisan attitudes do not help to get history right. But the large siege guns, which we're talking about, became, in fact, something like a trademark of Ottoman artillery. And we know they were in use at least since 1422, right, at Constantinople. We have a Byzantine chronicler, in fact, Ioannis Kananos, that records this very large, yet not particularly effective, telling the truth at this time, Turkish bombards, bombardae in Greek, which is actually an Hellenization of a Latin term in this, at least as it was in use. You know that the bombard was fundamentally the standard piece of artillery, at least in terms, in quantitative terms. So this time, there were other models were being developed. Largely speaking, the bombard was the easier model was to produce, and it still was capable of impressive. It was the AK-47 of the situation in modern assault rifle comparisons, and they took part of the siege of Constantinople at firing stones, according to the chronicle, of excessive weight and caliber, right? And however, the best source of information about this massive Ottoman guns belongs not to Constantinople 1422, but Constantinople 1453, where, as you know, the Ottomans basically staged one of the greatest siege work that they had ever put up, and that Thessalonica in 1430 they did an astonishing job. In 1453 that was big, right? And the idea is that the city was not easy to take at all, right? That this, we give much credit to the Ottomans for logistically speaking, organizationally speaking, that was an enterprise, right? Leave aside the fact that probably they had their gates open at some point by the internal Orthodox communities, but they didn't like the Catholics that were, by the way, fighting in the defense of the city for their own interest. And definitely, however, in 1453 we have the mention of the famous gun cast by an Hungarian, or possibly a Wallachian, some say even a German. We're talking about Urban, right? And who was basically a great entrepreneur of war, produced guns of different dimensions. He had offered his services to Constantine XI, as we were saying before, but basically the Byzantines didn't have the money for the same defense of Constantinople in 1453, by the way. But the emperor didn't have the money first. Secondly, these guns would have not found much of a good employment on the Theodosian walls. Basically were crumbling just because of the recoil of the guns, so it would have not been useless to hire him, and he therefore passed to Ottoman employ, right? And it's interesting, the origins of Urban in this regard that show how places like the Danubian area, wherever he came from, actually had already the competences, as we were saying before, to cast guns, that they mastered the craft, right? They had the technology and everything. And Critoboulos is another author who was not present at the siege, but he had information from eyewitnesses on both the Byzantine and the Ottoman side, at Constantinople 1453, describes these guns as 4 spans that is about 30 feet long, right, roughly 10 meters, with a barrel 8 inches thick and a bore of 30 inches in its muzzle, half of the stone shot, right, and a bore of 10 inches in its breech, half for the powder charge, right. And this size is basically the standard you will see in Ottoman armies during the second half of the 15th century. For example, we know 20 bombards, 27 feet long, among the ones besieging Belgrade in 1456, the ones on Rhodes, in 1480, that included 16 firing shot, 9 palms, about 27 inches in diameter, right? And there is this idea that Urban's gun was called Basilica, so the royal one, right? But the Oman states this, but at least here the text of reference doesn't really tell whether what's the source of that term. But for saying that the stereotypical monster bombard that we conceive, in Ottoman employment, it was naturally the peak gun, right? The largest employed was mostly around this moment. In fact, the moment of the greatest advance in throughout the Balkans, the Eastern Mediterranean, right? And Dukas, that is instead an eyewitness to the siege of Constantinople 1453, says that this monster bombard built by Orban was of bronze, while Giacomo Tedaldi was also present at the siege of 1453, informs us that the bombard was cast in one piece, which is different from most of the Ottoman bombards that we know from that time. Look, for example, at the Dardanelles gun that was in service on the Dardanelles, in fact, up to the 19th century, dates to this time, roughly, were built basically in 2 halves, screwing together. And this naturally had a lot to do with both, it was easier to produce in that, but also to transport, as we will see, which was a dramatic logistical problem. The sources about Urban's gun differ on the weight of its shot, especially. Tedaldi, for example, says that the shot was 1,900 pounds, right? You realize what this is? This is 400 kilos or something like that. Niccolò Barbaro says 1,200 pounds, while Leonard of Chios states that the stones were 11 palms in circumference, right? About 105 inches, therefore a diameter of about 33 inches. That, by the way, matches fairly closely with the bore quoted by Critobulus before. It stated was 30. Other sources claim a 12 to 15 palms in circumference, right? So a bit larger. Also, the Anconitan consul Benvenuto reports that Urban's cannon shot different types, different size fundamentally of shots, 1,300, 600, and 300 pounds, right? Albeit, we may think at this point that the author is referring to the weights of the shots fired by other guns in the same battery. As we will see in a while, we understand that these guns were deployed all in sets, in these pockets, like scattered all around the siege, and they had different calibers fundamentally, for reasons that we will explain. Calcocondyles, another source, states that Urban's gun fired shot of little over 3 talents. Everywhere it even says 2, which, considering the Roman talent of 57.6 pounds, this would make 175 pounds, so it's very few, considering what the other sources that define this gun as a terrifying, extraordinary monster actually say, right? And Calco-Condyles, however, adds interesting information about two smaller guns in the same battery of Urban's bombard that shot just half of a talent. Tedaldi records that Ottoman guns shot things like 800, 1,000, 1,200 pound shots, right? Barbaro reports that of the remaining 11 principal guns used in the siege, one fired shot of 800 pounds, rest something between 200 and 500 pounds less, right? So probably Calco-Condyles is underestimating the weight of the shots, and consequently the same size of the bombard, right? Tendentially we go by the smaller sizes as more accurate, but there's an overwhelming amount of sources states that this gun was that big, right? And this definitely caught the contemporary attention, and those numbers are from reliable sources. We have, in fact, further evidence of the sheer size of Urban's gun, right, and others that of its ilk that can be found in, for example, the large crew, and also the amount of animals that were necessary to transport the same gun, right? The Pseudo-Sphrantzes says their size was enormous, about other Turkish bombards. And he adds, quote, certain pieces of artillery could not be moved by the combined force of 40 or 50 pairs of oxen and 2,000 men. Right? We made a bit about the logistical difficulties of the guns' transportations in these times in history, and that making them pass, especially through the mountains, was a great feat of engineering, right? Think about the Balkanic hinterland, right? And think about the effort, the sheer motivation that takes, that tells a lot about the Ottoman invasions of this period, especially. And Leonard of Kiev states that Urban Monster Bombard itself could barely be moved even by 150 yoke of oxen, while Dukas states that quote, 30 wagons were linked together and 60 enormous oxen hauled it along. 200 men were deployed on each side of the cannon to support it so that it would not slip and fall onto the road, and 50 carpenters and 200 assistants went ahead of the wagons to construct wooden bridges wherever the road was uneven. So you understand once again here, not just about the about the employment of these guns, not of course the technology per se, construction techniques, the know-how, the material, but literally transporting this stuff. As we all see, the Ottomans will develop a part of probably of the Sultan's own army was at the center of the Ottoman forces at this point, deputed to transport artillery, right? So, by the way, these larger artilleries were directly under the Sultan's personal control. This is very important because it makes you really understand that what Ottoman power was identified by these monsters. Calco-Condyles reports that two such guns, this dimension, were dragged from the foundry of Edirne, right? Each requiring 70 oxen and 1,000 men to move it. And with this in mind, it's really not a surprise that many of these pieces were sometimes cast on site. Yes, I mean, basically they were not all built somewhere, eventually transported across, the Balkans, Greece, wherever, Turkey, but they were literally cast on spot, right, on the spot of the siege, and employed there. And for example, it happened on the Examilian, Strait of Corinth in 1446, at Croya in 1450, in Yatzia in 1464. And on this occasion, by the way, the siege failed, and the Sultan therefore ordered that the cannon to be pulled to the river Vurbas, near to the city, to be thrown into it, so that it could not fall into enemy hands. Think about the assets, right? Think about how much it meant just for an enemy, even to put hands on this thing. It was like an enormous asset for a normal power, European power, to have anything like that in the first place. And as a consequence, it's also thought, but this has really rather to do with how the army was melting away at the retreating, actually, that this cannon could not be transported back. So it was built like it was in this occasion on the spot. There was the problem finding a way out for it. Had things gone bad, like in this case. Certain cannons were cast on the spot, also the siege of Skutár in 1478, and Rhodes in 1480. Critopoulos claims that Urban's gun was cast before the walls of Constantinople, but this could actually refer to an even larger cannon that Leonard of Chios at least states that was ordered but never completed, and after Urban once was damaged. And Ottoman armies were usually provided as a consequence with supplies of bronze or copper and tin for casting bombards on the spot. However, this was the proof rather of a primitive system already in place, right? The practice of casting these pieces only on the place of the siege declined after Mehmed II's reign. There's this big turning point with the capture of Constantinople, so that logistics improved, resources were available in larger quantities. So at this point, the Ottoman army transitioned in something more permanent, better organized, and the guns, as a consequence, could be transported. And the mean of transportation was the Arab, right? That were these wagons, basically, that became responsibility of the specialist unit in the Sultan's private army. It was the top Arabazi, which means literally in Turkish gun carriage drivers, that were probably established by Murad II or even by Mehmed II. And some modern authorities are skeptical about the likelihood of more than the quantity, but rather the size of guns could be cast on site, right? Since the quality had to be of the highest order, and outside of the foundries, it was, permanent foundries was a bit difficult to, at least to replicate it. Like, it was not impossible, but by itself it costed definitely a lot. In this case, it's actually the sources that are pretty clear about the fact it was a real thing, right? And the point is interesting because in the Western chronicles of the time, there is much less evidence of this. So whatever this was in the Ottoman army, there was a very different approach towards artillery that, in fact, do not find in this sense, with these monster bombards, anything comparable, right? Not because evidently the Westerns couldn't build them. I mean, Orban was a Westerner, so they had the technology, but the point is that they weren't the Ottoman Empire. They weren't that specific power with that specific political and social background and those strategical needs that would require such monsters to be produced, and that in fact the same Ottomans abandoned at the peak of their power, actually. So actually before the peak of their power proper. So to say that these guns were a great achievement, but also they must be contextualized, and they were the best choice probably in the Ottoman conditions of the time, but not the ones of later times. So things change, and as a consequence. So there is a level of empiricism, as you understand, in this logistical and technical systems, after all, that show, as we were saying before, how driven actually the Ottomans were to achieve this expansion through storming. Literally, this big. What did the monster bombard serve to? Of course, was to blow up enemy walls, right? With powerful shots, right? And literally, the Ottomans now were assembling pretty large forces. So, we're in a time in which even relatively small castles or other fortifications could halt major armies, right? Artillery is becoming already at this time really something that makes the difference. At least for a power to dispose of them. It's just by the 16th century that the difference will start to be more determining in both on siege warfare, where of course things started earlier, but also on in open field, right? So, but here eventually the Ottomans want to achieve probably a result that is also separated from them by a relatively low, I wouldn't say low resistance, but I mean fighting against powers that are probably comparably smaller, that can, think about how by the defense of Constantinople. There is no comparison in that regard. So what you really want to do is to smash. Think about it in military terms. You really want to smash the walls and pour in with an overwhelming quantity of troops that just needs a breach, and then you send them in and they're done, right? So hence the need to produce larger guns, right? And that's why the reason the Europeans didn't use that, because the Europeans were evidently more used to, to kind of balance the to find a more balanced situation in siege warfare. Possibly, I'm not one to make it sounding war gamistic, as if this was the reality in every case, but there are definitely different objectives that want to be reached in here, and this has probably to do with the political and military balance of the contenders, right? So when the Ottomans meet mostly the Western European dimension, they also abandoned the systems themselves. So this is important to note in many ways. But that's the point we were making before, that the Ottoman invasions at this point were relatively easy from a political point of view, more difficult from a logistical and politic point of view, hence the need to find the gun that just opens the damn bridge and then, doesn't, for your army not to meet much of a resistance afterwards, right? This is probably the reason that brings to development of such guns. Regarding the logistical problems, there are, however, exceptions. The fact that, for example, Urban's gun was, according to Leonard of Chios, actually cast in the gun foundry at Adrianople rather than inside is an indicator that anyhow certain production and transportation needs were, however, associated with the most common practices, other powers as well, and by the way, Leonard of Chios is stating that Urban's gun burst, right? It exploded. Calcocondyles and Pseudo-Sphrantzes also support this claim, the latter saying, quote, "On account of the constant firing and of the great impurity of the metal, the Sultan's biggest cannon exploded into many fragments, and it was being fired and dealt death and wounds to many." Right, from here, Pierce actually knew that Urban was among the casualties, but as far as I understood, we don't know what source actually states this, but this is usually the story. Look at Urban, he sold his services to the Muslims and his gun exploded and he died. But I haven't found the evidence for this, while the anonymous Slavic chronicle that was seemingly based on a night witness account of the siege of 1453 while confirming the gun's burst, right, it states that Urban's bombard was actually repaired 3 days later, right? And this probably explains also what Barbaro states about it being the bombard being used at the final assault to the Theodosian walls. Ducas too specifically states that the gun survived the siege of 1453 and that quote, afterwards was preserved and continued to carry out the tyrant's will. One of Mehmed II. And indeed, as we were saying before, such monster bombards were still in use up to the 19th century. I mean, ask the British trying to pass the Dardanelles. And also, we have naturally evidence, like for it was normal in siege warfare at that time, that there were lots of other cannons employed, right? When the attention is concentrated on these monster bombards, but for one of those there were actually tens, if not hundreds, of other guns. In fact, a Genoese eyewitness, Montaldo, states that there were 200 guns and tormenta, right? The tormenta is the in Latin the average term for for a siege engine, fundamentally, preferably a missile one. And Montaldo, by the way, is the only source that actually tries to guess the exact number of guns used at the siege of Constantinople by the Ottomans, which means that the others probably were or both polarized by the bigger gun and kind of skipped the presence of others. It was actually normal in sieges of that time. Like, of course, not everything was bet on the big gun. Right? Still, there were lots of others that were employed in this way to, really to hammer the fortifications for a very long time. Right? Consider, they took a lot to reload, so sometimes there was even time to repair the fortifications as a consequence, etc. And this went on as a kind of concerts of all, bigger and smaller instruments playing all together, let's say. And other sources, however, give us other useful details on Ottoman artillery, and it was organized on the occasion of 1453. Barbaro states that the biggest guns were arranged in 4 batteries of 2, 3, and 4 pieces. The last including Urban's monster, right? And therefore, this battery probably consisted of 4 guns shooting the 800 to 1900 pounds recorded by Tetaldi before, and though, as we have seen, Calco Condyles stated that the battery, including Urban's gun, comprised only 3 knob, but I mean, this is a detail. Pseudo-Sphrantzes claims that the Ottoman artillery concentrated its fire on 14 points on the defenses. This was also another deal. The opening a breach, as we've seen, was the most important aspect of this, especially, usually sieges were, so this attack the walls, literally from all possible sides, right? Because this naturally diluted the defenses over the along the perimeter, and also didn't create problems of concentration of troops. This source, by the way, implies that there were 14 batteries stationed in front of this 14 points to break, and this is where eventually the assault was launched. And there are certain mistakes, probably due to, in certain studies, quoting Oman, that probably was quoting on Pierce, right? It states that the batteries were 9, with each containing 4 smaller bombards, etc. But these are mistakes. We skip them. We don't spread the rumor further. And as we were seeing at the beginning of the video, there was an enormous amount of European renegades among the gunners, right? They were probably the majority of Turkish gunners in this point. This went on throughout all the 15th century, especially. I mean, by the 14th century, the Ottomans are still, fairly isolated. By the 15th century, instead, they start being capable of attracting this wider amount of personnel through, the investments, etc. We found men as Urban, also the German master gunner Meister Georg Schwerpunkt, right, who sighted and commanded Mehmed's artillery at the siege of Rhodes. By the way, our major siege that actually failed, but I still had this huge display of Ottoman firepower. And Leonard of Chios states that the Ottoman engineers at Constantinople included Greeks, Latins, Germans, Hungarians, and Bohemians. Right? It's very interesting here that probably the Danubian dimension is connected with Constantinople. After all, the Black Sea traffic, think even about the Crusades the Europeans had launched or passing through the Danube. So that was also a major highway for hiring people coming from Central Europe, and that were tendentially closer in many ways to Western Europeans, to the world theater, right? The Ottoman advance, of course, is knocking at the door gradually. Serbia, Hungary, Austria, and from there Bohemia, Poland, right? They're next door. So they are also starting being influenced, to falling to the same influence of the Ottoman Empire, generally speaking, right? We've talked a lot about the typical 16th, 17th century fashion of Middle European princes that basically gifting each other with perfect copies of Ottoman panoplies that they estimated as one of the most precious gifts. And indeed, in the 16th century, as you know, the Ottomans knock at Vienna's doors by land. So that this also explains in part the extraction of these people. Also, Zorzi Dolphin, that is another eyewitness to the siege of Constantinople 1450. There were many people looking at that, indeed. Describes how Mehmed, quote, hired German cannon makers at a great fee to come where and when he wished to cast cannon for him. Right, so especially the Germans here were praised as cannon makers. Considered that indeed Germany had it was actually, together with Italy, the most technologically advanced country in Europe, right? These politically fragmented areas of the empire that produced, greater, freer middle classes that were very entrepreneurial. The Germans were especially, in the fields of, mechanics. Think about mechanical clocks, from which also the wheel lock pistol will essentially be invented in the 16th century. These guys had all the techniques, the componentistic, we could say, that was needed to build. And here we find that the Ottomans specifically want to hire them, so that they pay higher fees specifically for the Germans. This is interesting because, in historical perspective, that there has always been this kind of German-Turkish connection that arrives. In terms of exchange of, industry and exports and things that, had in many ways its roots in this very moment, right? As it can be seen historically, even, think about World War I, or even about today, look at German industry componentistic, in part actually is Turkish, in great part. So there is a lot of, it's that intersection that we're talking about at the beginning of the video, this great reality of exchange rather than just fight that contributed to define properly what we'd call, even as Europe in this regard. And contemporaries of the siege of Belgrade in 1456 similarly reported that the Ottoman culverines were manned by Germans, Hungarians, Bosnians, and Dalmatians, and the big siege guns by Germans and Italians. And these would have all been elements of the unit known as the Topku Otsaki. So this specific unit aimed at, a certain degree of permanent character that was established as a part of the Kapukalki. That we've seen, it was probably the Sultan's own army. We made an entire video on its organization by Murad II, and was divided in two distinct parts comprising foundry and artillerists. Right, so still this kind of mobile gun production, manufacturing capabilities. The unit was commanded by an aga with the title of Bashi and was subdivided into ortas, presumably of about 50 men. And the top two Otsaki might have originally numbered 700 men, right? And the other unit was probably of similar size as well. There was a similar unit established apparently at the same time and organized along the identical lines known as the Umbaratium, right, or mortar men. Mortars also grew in importance. As you know, they have this more parabolical trajectory that allows to simply go past the walls and fall inside. It can be used also in defense, and especially against ships, as in this also Aegean context where the Ottomans are expanding in a defensive sense, that can be of use. In fact, Kritovolos, that states that basically the mortars were used the first time during the siege of Constantinople, if I'm not wrong, states that on this occasion they were required specifically by Mehmed II to his gun founders to make a different sort of gun with a slightly changed design that could fire a stone to a great height, so that when it came down it would hit the ships and sink them, because they at this point the Ottomans during the siege were unable to fire directly on the ships sheltering in the Golden Horn, and this is allegedly the introduction of mortars in Ottoman employ, according to the source. But mortars were also a typical weapon since the 14th century. I mean, in siege warfare, so we can doubt that 1453 was the first one. But it still reveals the detail of the anti-ship take. I mean, the fact that that it could bypass the walls and hit, in this case, the ships that were sheltering there. But it's somewhat true that after the siege of Constantinople, Ottoman mortars appear more frequently during sieges, right? For example, there were 7 among the 300 guns at Belgrade, and 12 bronze examples at Rhodes, firing 5 rounds a day. Very interesting insight about the procedure of gunners operating Urban's monster is provided by Kritovolos, that states, quote, "First they put into it that which is called powder, filling the chamber behind completely up to the mouth of the enlarged part of the bore, which is intended for the stone shot. Then they introduced a great stopper, a very strong plug of wood, which they batter down with iron rammers, so that it shall closely confine the powder in such a way that only the force of the ignited power can discharge it. Then they placed the stone shot upon it, ramming this down forcefully so as to make it enter into the wooden plug and make a round cavity." So basically, the plug was concave, to receive the shot. And after this, having turned the cannon towards the target and given it an angle of elevation according to the rules of their art and experience, they brought great beams of wood which they laid under it and on top and on all sides, so that it might not be disturbed, and strike wide of the mark as a result of the shock and the recoil. After all this, they applied the fire to the little orifice behind. Dukas also provides us with another interesting detail, describing the procedure that was used to determine the range of the shot. Quote, "When the gunner wished to discharge a large stone, he first took the range of the target by firing a small one, and then, taking skillful aim, he would fire the large." This, for example, is an alternative explanation to Benvenuto's claim that a gun fired 3 weights of shot, right? So it was not about the gun being conceived for shooting 3 types of shots, but basically using this other smaller ones that were enough for measuring the distance and not wasting the bigger shots. By the way, were all fabricated oppositely, so that would have been a waste. But you understand that even in here, that the methods that we have seen of aiming from Critavoulus was very empirical, like with all the frame that was dramatically important to stabilize the shot, right, and to continue, especially in this hammering of the walls, with a certain degree of precision, right? You can imagine all the, literally, in fact, the art that was behind this thing, right? You were in the Renaissance. There is all, submerged side of the technological accomplishments that we mostly read from in treatises and these other details, but there were literally people making a living about this. So if you see the market that existed about this engineer, so you can imagine how many people mastered this craft, but maybe were not educated enough to, or interested enough to write actually about it. They simply worked through it, right? And continuing the on this point, think about even the cooling the barrel, right? That how low the rate of fire really was, right? It was very risky, as you know, to man these weapons. Orban's gun, as we've seen, bursted into the thing. And the Calcocondyles states that the biggest gun at Constantinople 1453 shot only 7 times in a day, right, and once at night. Guns at the siege of Shkodër fired at first only about 4 shots a day, right, and though their rate of fire steadily increased during the course of the siege, 17 to 18 shots a day was the best day's average to be achieved for the period of the siege, for which records exist, at least during which time a total of 2,534 shots were fired, right? And this doesn't seem great, considering, for example, that there were 1,000 shots a day allegedly fired during the siege of Rhodes. So you see here even an improvement overall. Not much of the technology per se, was basically the same thing, but presumably here the organizational capability. I mean, the fact of having enough pieces shooting alternatively and therefore saving time, right? It was all changed. It's not just the technology that is improving gradually, but literally the resources that can be invested in this all to regularize, to homogenize and fluidify the whole mechanism. Tetaldi states, however, that at the siege of Constantinople 1453, quote, each day the cannon were fired between 100 and 120 times, right? And he presumably refers to the 12 principal guns that Barbaro enumerated. There is also another aspect that is somewhat overlooked, that still at this time, and presumably in Eastern warfare more than in Western one, gunpowder artillery was sighted by trebuchet, right, as late as 1480. Actually, this happened. We made a video on Western trebuchet as well, observing how long they remain. In fact, up to the end of the 15th century. There is much evidence of it for the Ottomans at the siege of Rhodes, for example. Pseudo-Sphrantzes records also that at the final siege of Constantinople, the Ottoman trebuchet that were at least a dozen within a week of the attack beginning, quote, caused damage to many lustrous houses and parts of the palace situated in the vicinity of the walls, and also elsewhere referring to the Ottomans says, demolishing parts of our walls here and there with the artillery and trebuchet. Right? So the trebuchet were, in a way, the complementary the natural complementary of firearms at this point, right? Still, there was something more you could achieve with, the larger trebuchet than with the smaller bombard, right? And after all, it's about the let's say anachronistically, the doctrine of employment of this siege machinery that we should maybe look at a bit more closely in other videos. But we actually made it, especially on the video on the long sunset of trebuchet warfare, that talks essentially about this, that fundamentally how medieval siege warfare had been this concert, as we've seen before, of lots of machineries operating at the same time, right, hammering the walls from every side. And gunpowder artillery began in the same identical way, because when it was created, it was not even enough to tear down walls so easily, and therefore it was also more difficult to produce literally, the same pieces. So it was easier to produce many of them, but fairly small. That's also why you rarely hear of them, and they get mixed together among words like tormenta, as we were saying before with Montalto, and therefore they didn't probably even make much of a sensation in that regard. Their effect, in fact, was not very different from the rest of artillery or trebuchets, other means. So this was a very gradual passage, and as far as we can see, the Ottomans probably didn't differ excessively much from other powers, even Western ones and Eastern ones alike, in siege warfare, right? Except this pinnacle represented by the monster bombard that we have to try to frame in its context and to be justified, right? And remember, in this sense, that probably the political / propagandistic side of the story, this is showing the bigger gun, was an enormous deal at that time, was all one with practical employment, right? Of course, for example, Orban's monster bomber is famous mostly because it eventually exploded, right? Not much because how big it was, but as we have seen, we're not even sure of that. It was fixed apparently, and there were also many other of these monster bombers. So the point is that if they invested so much in one gun, that by itself, in comparison to the others, in relative terms, is something way more demanding, right? Because if you have a gun that, let's say, is big 1, and there is another that is big 2, the logistical resources required for the larger one are not twice the ones of the smaller one. They're more than twice, right? So this is really apparently a disproportionate investment, but evidently, if it was replicated so often, it's because it really served the specific purpose that, in that regard, maybe the smaller gun cannot achieve. So this is actually a big deal, and consider that even the Theodosian walls in 1453, everybody says, oh, they were obsolete. Well, for those time standards, like, they were becoming obsolete, but still they were doing their job in practical terms. So it doesn't just take to have, once again, gunpowder technology to nullify certain logistical problems, right? Constantinople was not taken because of the single gun, but because of the whole thing to get put together, right? That goes from, of course, the army in the first place, because the single most important thing were the infantry, the missile troops, the cavalry even, and then the artillery, and then the logistical capabilities, and then the political and social drive and everything, and the external context and how many troops defended the city and everything, right? So you understand how technology becomes lesser and lesser important when you frame these military events in their actual context. But the point still is that the development of artillery in these 14th, 15th century Ottoman warfare is symptomatic, definitely, of this broader needs, essentially, of storming these major cities of the Eastern Mediterranean and fortresses of the Balkan hinterland that were, I mean, some of the toughest nuts to crack in that regard, and required a great commitment, an enormous investment of resources that, however, built for the Ottomans, the empire that lasted for so many centuries, and evidently, it was a good investment after all. So never, let's say, dismiss things like, this is so big, it's no use. Because, let's be honest about it, combat is the last place where you get with useless stuff, right? And even if there are mistakes throughout all military history and politics and eventually even doctrine and etc., but still what is used in practice and it lasts is evidently worth it, right? And it must be considered in these terms. Alright, so for today we stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.